I just touched.
What the hell is going on? What did you do?
You thought they were dead? No, Nix, they're evolving.
The silence of Outpost. Genesis 9 was unnatural. A silence too heavy, too perfect, like the vacuum of space itself had crept inside and swallowed every sound. The research station drifted in orbit above Veyros 3, an uncharted ice world that no longer held secrets, only horrors. Nixavari moved through the dim corridors, her gloved hands clenched at her sides. The station's artificial lights flickered erratically, bathing the metal walls in pulses of cold fluorescence. The air was still, stale. It carried the distinct stench of rot that even the station's ventilation couldn't scrub away. Something had gone wrong here, something unnatural, and Nix was at the center of it. Her breathing was slow and controlled, but beneath the calm she felt the cold grip of terror. Not fear of the thing hunting them in the dark, though she had every right to fear it, but fear of herself. Her footsteps halted in front of a door, labeled Cryogenics Lab. The reinforced glass panel was streaked with a thin layer of frost from the inside. The temperature regulators had failed days ago, yet the ice coating the walls wasn't from environmental malfunction. It was from her. Nix's throat tightened as she pressed a hand against the door. She already knew what she would find, but she had to look, had to see. The lock released with a hiss, and the heavy door groaned open. The cold inside wasn't just the biting chill of deep space. This was something worse, something absolute. 5 bodies stood frozen in place, their forms contorted in the final moments of life. Their flesh was a brittle shade of blue, their eyes clouded over with frost. One man had collapsed onto his knees, his face twisted in a silent scream. Another woman had raised her arms as if trying to shield herself from something, but Nix knew better. There had been no time to run. They had been alive when she touched them. A sharp sound, a shift of weight against metal, made Nix spin. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she braced herself for an attack. But there was nothing. Just the whisper of recycled air filtering through vents. She exhaled, slow and measured, forcing herself to step away from the door. The station's comms were dead. The emergency beacon had been activated nearly a week ago, but no response had come. They were alone up here, alone with it. She clenched her hands tighter, suppressing the tremor in her fingers. She should be dead like the others. But something had kept her alive, something she didn't understand, and she wasn't the only one. A voice cut through the silence, deep and laced with exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here." Nix turned sharply, her pulse spiking. A figure stood in the shadow of the corridor, tall, broad-shouldered, and human. Dine Rylos. He wasn't part of the research team. He wasn't even supposed to be here. A prisoner, held in containment for transport. She hadn't known what his crimes were before everything fell apart, and she hadn't cared. But now he was the only one left. The first time she had seen him after the outbreak, she had tried to push him away. "Run, I'll kill you," she had warned. But Dain hadn't run. He had taken her wrist, forced her to look him in the eyes, and said, "Do it." And nothing had happened. Her touch, her curse, whatever the hell it was, had turned every living thing into ice, but not him. That should have terrified her more than anything. "Did you find anything?" Dane asked now, stepping closer. His dark eyes flicked toward the frozen bodies in the lab, but his expression remained unreadable. He had stopped reacting to things like that after the second day. Nyx shook her head. "They didn't make it." His jaw tensed. "Figures." They didn't talk about the others, about how many they had already lost. There was no point in counting when the numbers only went one way. Nyx moved past him, her boots silent against the frozen floor. "We need to get to the command deck. If the emergency systems are still functional, we might be able to override lockdown." Dane fell into step beside her. "And then what? Wait for a rescue that isn't coming?" She exhaled sharply. "You have a better plan." Dane didn't answer. He just walked, his body a shadow against the flickering corridor lights. She was grateful for the silence. They reached a set of security bulkheads, the last barrier between them and the command deck. Dane tapped at the control panel, but the system was fried. He muttered something under his breath and tried a second time, but the panel only gave a shrill, denied access beep. Nyx stepped forward. The door had a manual override, but that meant touching it with her bare hand. She hesitated. Dane noticed. "I'll do it." She shook her head. "Number it has to be me." Carefully, she peeled off one of her gloves. The air against her bare skin felt like needles, but she had grown used to it. She pressed her palm to the override pad. Instantly, a layer of frost spread outward from her fingers, veins of ice crawling through the system's wiring. The panel sparked once, then flickered and died. The door hissed open. Dane exhaled, giving her a long look. "You're getting better at that." Nyx didn't reply. She didn't want to be better at this. They stepped into the command deck, and the stale air felt even heavier here. The emergency lights glowed red, illuminating the shattered remains of control consoles and overturned chairs. Something had happened here, something violent. Dane moved to one of the displays, trying to access the external logs. "This whole station is a tomb." Nyx barely heard him. Her gaze had caught on something else. Near the far wall, partially obscured by a fallen chair, was a frozen body. But unlike the others, this one wasn't blue. It was blackened, charred. The surface of its skin cracked like burned glass, its mouth twisted open in a silent, gaping maw. Not frozen. Something else entirely. Something new. A deep, inhuman scraping echoed from the far end of the corridor behind them. Dane froze. His hand instinctively moved toward the weapon at his side. Nyx's breath caught in her throat. They weren't alone. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate scraping, like claws raking against metal. Nyx Avari stood frozen, her breath shallow. The command deck was bathed in dim emergency lighting, the sharp red glow casting shadows that moved when nothing should. She swallowed hard and exchanged a glance with Dane. He had already drawn his weapon, a compact pulse pistol scavenged from a dead security officer. "Back against the wall," he murmured. She did as he said, pressing herself into the cold metal, fists clenched. The bulkhead door leading to the main corridor was still half open from their forced entry. Beyond it, the station loomed in eerie silence. The scraping had stopped. Then came the sound of something wet, slick, shifting through the vents. Nyx barely kept herself from shuddering. Dane moved first. He advanced toward the open doorway, his steps soundless. He tilted his head, listening, and then motioned her forward. They couldn't stay in the command deck. The main power was dead, and the emergency overrides were useless without a functioning core. The longer they remained in one place, the more they risked being found. Nyx took a slow breath and followed. They slipped back into the corridor, moving past the charred, frozen corpse she had found earlier. The sight of it made her skin crawl. Unlike the others she had frozen, this one hadn't simply turned to ice. It had shattered inward, as if something had broken free from the inside. She didn't want to think about it. Dane led the way, his weapon steady in his grip. The hall ahead was lined with closed doors leading to crew quarters, now abandoned. Some were sealed with biohazard warnings, hastily scrawled messages in marker, "Do not open," a grim reminder that whatever had happened here had been far beyond containment. Nyx had seen the security feeds before the station's power failed. The first bodies had been found in the medical bay, victims of sudden seizures, their veins blackened, their skin cracking open like fractured ice. The station's research team had tried to isolate the infection, but within hours, those same bodies had begun to move again. That was when everything fell apart. A whisper of movement came from ahead. Dane lifted his weapon. Nyx held her breath. The door to one of the crew quarters creaked open. Something stepped out. The shape was human, or had been once. It wore the tattered remains of a Genesis 9 uniform, but the thing inside the fabric was no longer a person. Its skin was a translucent, frost-bitten white, stretched too thin over its frame. Its limbs were unnaturally elongated, fingers tapering into black, talon-like claws. The worst was its face, if it could even be called that. Its jaw was too wide, unhinged like a snake's, and its mouth. Nyx's stomach lurched. There were no teeth, just a deep, gaping hole lined with pulsing, frozen tissue, as if its insides had been scooped out, leaving nothing but an endless abyss. It wasn't breathing, it wasn't blinking, it was listening. The moment Nyx shifted, its head snapped toward her. Dane fired. The pistol's pulse shot hit the creature square in the chest. The impact sent it staggering back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a horrible, brittle sound, something between a hiss and a shriek, and lunged forward at impossible speed. Dane barely had time to fire a second shot before it was on him. He twisted away at the last second, and the creature crashed into the wall, its claws carving deep gouges into the metal. It moved with jerky, unnatural movements, as if its body was still learning how to function. Nyx didn't think. She ripped off her glove and grabbed the creature's arm. The effect was instant. Ice crawled across its flesh, spreading faster than it had with anything else. The thing seized, its grotesque, gaping maw opening in silent agony as frost consumed its entire form. In seconds, it was completely encased. Then it shattered apart, fragments scattering across the floor in glistening shards. Silence. Nyx staggered back, chest heaving. Dane pushed himself up from where he had hit the wall, breathing heavily. He stared at the scattered remains of the creature, his expression unreadable. "That wasn't just a mutation," he said after a moment. "That thing, it wasn't just infected. It was changing. Nix swallowed. It was still alive. Dane looked at her sharply. She clenched her fists. It felt different when I froze it, like something inside was still moving. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Dane exhaled sharply and turned back toward the corridor. "We need to get to the research wing," he said. "We need answers." Nix didn't argue. She knew he was right. But the deeper they went into the station, the more the air felt wrong, like they were being watched. The research wing was colder than the rest of the station. The vents had failed days ago, leaving the air sharp and dry, thick with the stale scent of old chemicals and something else. Decay, but not from rot. Nix Avari stepped carefully over a collapsed console, her boots crunching against the frost-coated floor. The emergency lights flickered in erratic pulses, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift when no one moved. They weren't alone here. Dain Rylos moved ahead of her, weapon in hand, his posture tense. His breath misted in the freezing air as he approached the main lab doors. "Still locked," he muttered, tapping at the cracked interface. Nix reached forward, pulling off one glove. She placed her bare hand against the panel. The effect was instant. Frost spread through the circuits, seizing the locking mechanism in an ice-bound grip. A second later, the door shuddered and hissed open. Beyond it, the lab was a graveyard of failed experiments. Glass cylinders lined the walls, some shattered, others still intact, their contents frozen in states of horrific transformation. Things that had once been human but were no longer recognizable. One had split open at the torso, its insides a latticework of crystallized tendrils, pulsing faintly under layers of ice. Another was suspended in fluid, its head grotesquely elongated, jaws fused together, veins spreading outward like jagged black roots. Nix clenched her teeth. This wasn't just infection. This was controlled evolution. Dane approached a main console, wiping a thick layer of frost from the screen. The station's power failures had corrupted most of the logs, but a few files remained intact. He tapped one. A video log flickered to life. A grainy image filled the screen. Dr. Varos Wren stood in this very lab, his face gaunt with exhaustion, eyes wide with something too eager to be fear. Behind him, one of the experiments twitched in its containment unit, something beneath its skin writhing as he spoke. Subject Z Theta's resistance to thermal extremes is beyond expectation. The parasite adapts even in frozen stasis. Tissue remains viable, able to reconstruct from minimal organic material. More testing is required. We must push it further. The feed glitched. The next frame showed something different. A body on the floor, its head collapsed inward, the ribcage flaring outward in jagged, ice-rimed spines. Dr. Wren's voice was calmer now, almost reverent. The ice isn't stopping it. The freezing just forces another layer of adaptation. Every cycle, it emerges faster, stronger. The process is beautiful. Nix felt bile rise in her throat. Dain swore under his breath. This wasn't a research accident. His fingers tightened around the grip of his pistol. This bastard let it happen. A slow clap echoed from behind them. Nix spun. Dr. Varos Wren stood in the open doorway, framed by the flickering red emergency lights. His face was gaunt, his dark hair slick with sweat, but his eyes burned with something cold and calculating. "You finally made it," he said. "I was starting to think you'd never figure it out." Dane lifted his weapon. "You knew?" Ren's expression was almost amused. "Of course I knew." Nyx felt her blood run colder than usual. "You let them die." Ren sighed as he stepped inside, surveying the ruined lab as if it were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "They were insignificant," he said. "We were on the verge of something greater, and you—" He turned his gaze on Nyx, and his voice softened, almost admiring. "You proved the final variable." Her stomach twisted. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ren stepped closer, unbothered by the weapon Dane still had aimed at his head. "The parasite can be stalled by freezing," he continued, his voice smooth, too calm. "But never eradicated. It learns, it adapts. And yet, when you touch it, something happens. Something I don't fully understand yet." He exhaled, eyes gleaming. "You don't just freeze it. You force it into a deeper state of evolution. The bodies you leave behind aren't dead. They're becoming something else." Nyx's breath hitched. The memory of the shattered corpse from the command deck flashed in her mind. The blackened, cracked skin. The something new that had been waiting inside. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I kill them." Ren's smile widened. "Do you?" Dane moved first. He grabbed Ren by the collar, slamming him hard against the nearest console. "You set this up. You let them infect." His voice was barely restrained fury. "Why?" Ren didn't flinch. If anything, he looked pleased. "Because survival is meaningless without purpose," he said. "And now, we finally have one." Nyx was already moving before she even processed it. Her bare hand grabbed Ren's wrist, her fingers pressing into his pulse point. The ice spread instantly, but Ren didn't struggle. Instead, he smiled. A sharp, wet crack split through the silence. Ren's arm shattered, but there was no blood, no frozen marrow, no severed bone. There was movement beneath the skin, something twisting inside his exposed flesh. Nyx stumbled back, horror clawing up her throat. Dane dragged her away, gun still aimed at Ren's chest. The scientist exhaled shakily, rolling his shoulders. The stump of his frozen arm barely bled, something already knitting it back together. "I had to be sure," he murmured. "Had to see it myself." Nyx couldn't breathe. He was already infected. Ren's eyes met hers, and she realized with cold, gut-churning clarity, he had done it on purpose. "I don't want to stop this," he said softly. "I want to evolve." Dane fired. The shot tore through Ren's chest, knocking him backward. He collapsed against the console, gasping. But even as blood pooled around him, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile anymore. The wound in his chest was already sealing shut. Dane grabbed Nyx's wrist, pulling her toward the exit. "We need to move." Nyx couldn't stop staring. Dr. Ren, what was left of him, was already getting back up. The emergency sirens howled through the station as Nyx and Dane ran. The corridors blurred past in flickering red light, the steel walls groaning as if the outpost itself was trying to tear apart from the inside. Behind them, something inhuman stirred. Nyx didn't dare look back. She could hear it, The wet, unnatural shifting of bone and sinew, the crackling of ice forming and breaking, reforming again. Dr. Varos Wren was no longer human. His body had begun the final phase of transformation, shedding the last remnants of mortality like brittle glass. His laughter had twisted into something impossibly warped, a chorus of overlapping tones, rising and falling in discordant echoes. "Nix," Dane's voice was tight, urgent. "Get to the pod." They were close. The station was losing altitude, orbit breaking. The ship was dying, its emergency thrusters sputtering, unable to correct course. If they didn't reach the escape pod now, they'd go down with it. A shriek tore through the corridor. Not human, not even remotely alive. Nix staggered as the pressure in the air changed, a deep, vibrating pulse that rattled through her skull. Her vision blurred for a second, her legs threatening to give way. Dane grabbed her arm, half pulling, half carrying her forward. The escape hatch loomed ahead, a single white door, its panel still blinking green. Their way out. Their only chance. Dane slapped the override. The hatch hissed open, revealing the pod, a compact metal shell barely big enough for two. "Get in." Nix hesitated. The air in the corridor had gone still. The lights flickered, then died completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. A single sound filled the void. The slow, deliberate click of claws against metal. Then a voice that was no longer Wren's, but something using his mouth, his throat, his shape. "Running is pointless, Nix." She whipped around, pulse hammering. Wren, or what was left of him, stood at the end of the corridor. His body had stretched, elongated beyond human proportions. His skin had split in multiple places, the fractures revealing something moving inside, thick frozen tendrils, pulsing with a sickly frost-bitten light. His jaw had unhinged completely, widening into a yawning, abyssal maw. But his eyes were still there, human, aware. Nix's stomach twisted. "Nix!" Dane's grip on her wrist tightened. "Now!" But she didn't move. Something inside her snapped. This was her fault. She had let this happen. Her touch had never been a curse, never been a weapon. It had been a key, a means of unlocking the final stage of something humanity was never meant to witness. It had to end. She looked at Dane. "Go." His face twisted. "No. There's no time. I'm not leaving you." A shuddering tremor rocked the station. The walls screamed as metal began to buckle. Wren, or the thing inside him, tilted his head, watching them, waiting. Nix made her choice. She tore herself from Dane's grasp and lunged forward. Wren's mouth split wider in grotesque delight. He wanted this. He wanted her to touch him again, but not like before. Nix didn't reach for his skin. She wrapped both arms around his torso, pressing her entire body against him. A shockwave of freezing energy exploded outward. For the first time, Nix didn't hold back. She let her curse consume everything, every cell, every molecule, every parasitic tendril still clinging to Wren's body. A howl ripped from his throat, something deeper than sound, a vibration that sent hairline fractures ripping through the walls. The creature convulsed. The ice spread too fast for it to resist, crawling through every nerve, every mutated organ, until the movement inside him, The thing still trying to rebuild went still. Ren, what had once been Ren, collapsed into himself. His body crystallized in an instant, his form becoming nothing more than a jagged, frozen shell. His eyes were the last to change, wide and aware, still human even at the very end. Then he shattered. Nyx fell to her knees, chest heaving. The entire station lurched, emergency sirens wailing, debris crashing down from the ceiling. The structure was failing. They were out of time. Dine was suddenly there, dragging her to her feet, shoving her toward the escape pod. "Move!" Nyx stumbled inside, Dine following close behind. The hatch sealed shut the moment they were in, the pod shuddering as it detached from the failing station. Through the viewport, Outpost Genesis 9 burned. The research station crumbled, spiraling toward Veyros 3's frozen wasteland, its shattered remains vanishing into the thick, icy atmosphere below. Nyx slumped against the wall, every muscle trembling. It was over. She turned to Dane. He was breathing heavily, his face smeared with blood. She wasn't even sure if it was his. His eyes met hers. "You alive?" he asked. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she nodded. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of the station, but something lighter. A silence that meant they had survived. For the first time, Nyx let herself breathe. Then something cold slid down the back of her throat. Her stomach twisted violently. The moment she inhaled, she felt it. Something wrong, deep inside her chest. Diane's face blurred, her limbs numbed, the heat in her veins turned to ice. Nyx's breath hitched. "Number, no, no, no." Diane's voice reached her, distant, worried. "Nyx." She tried to answer, but she couldn't speak. A small, almost imperceptible pulse echoed through her skull, like something awakening. Dane touched her shoulder. His skin was warm. She didn't freeze him. Her fingers trembled. Then she exhaled, and the air left her lips in a slow, frost-bitten breath. Something inside her had changed. The parasite wasn't dead. It was inside her now, and for the first time it was awake. For the first time in her life, she was the one who felt cold.